Good morning and welcome to today's Policy Perspectives webinar. Our topic is Advancing Health and Racial Equity Through Housing. My name is Manal Abalada and I am your moderator for today's session. I serve as Managing Director for the California Endowment. My work here focuses on inclusive community development and strategy implementation in the North region. Joining us today are three dynamic leaders who have dedicated their careers to creating conditions for health, equity, and racial justice. They, along with many partners, have informed our state's thinking about the critical relationships between housing and health equity, the actions required to redress harms brought about by exclusionary zoning, redlining, and other forms of housing discrimination, and the valuable and added value roles that a health philanthropy like TCE can contribute to a field that is highly technical, often fractured, but also whose success is vital to improving the health outcomes of all Californians. First, we will hear from Melissa Jones, Executive Director of BARHI, the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. Melissa will frame today's conversation. She will describe why housing is a significant determinant of health, underline how racism has fundamentally shaped the inequities we see at every point in the housing arena, and offer us ways to apply reparative approaches that will get us on a path toward fair and just housing for all Californians. Melissa will then be joined by Shioni Flegel, who has taken the helm as Executive Director of Housing California, and Sam Tepperman-Gelfand, Managing Director at Public Advocates. Together, our speakers will paint a clear picture of the depth of the housing crisis we're in, tease out some of the lessons that advocates have learned from the dramatic shifts in housing policy and practice during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they will point us toward policy approaches that could address the challenges we face at the scale that is necessary. Please know that while we will be discussing policy, these webinars are nonpartisan and non-political informational sessions. Policy Perspectives brings together partners and policy experts to better understand state and federal issues impacting California communities. There is no political call to action as part of this webinar, but we do hope you come away activated and inspired. After the panel conversation, we will have time for Q&A. Please feel free to post questions in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them along with questions that our early registrants submitted and which helped us shape today's conversation. Lastly, a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and made available along with speaker bios and other resources after the event. Now, let's get into it. Melissa, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Manal. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be streamed through the internet to all of you today. I am Melissa Jones with BARHI. BARHI is the coalition of the Bay Area's, San Francisco Bay Area's governmental public health departments. And we are a unique entity. We were founded explicitly to focus on the issues that impact health outside of the doctor's office. We are a longtime partner, I know, with many of you on this call in the fight for housing affordability and health. And I've been asked to spend a few minutes this morning talking through some of the important connections between housing, health equity, and racial justice for us here in California. At BARHI, we've spent the last decade in the fight for healthier communities, starting first with housing. And we're starting first with housing because it's so dramatically affecting the face of who lives here and what our opportunities are. As California's income inequality has grown and driven increases in housing price, along with many other things I'm sure we'll talk about today, we have really seen increased pressures around displacement that I know many of you are working on, and really increased amounts of family budgets spent on housing. 7 years ago, the health departments in the San Francisco Bay Area hosted a very important retreat. At that retreat, we talked about the future of the Bay Area, and we talked about the issues most shaping health equity for our region. And hands down, across the board, the conversation and priority was on housing, how it was reshaping who lived here, the housing costs, how it was forcing unhealthy conditions in housing, the things that we've known around lead paint, but all kinds of other different kinds of challenges that were impacting mold and other kinds of abatement, that when housing costs are simply too high, there just aren't choices around. And talking about the importance of this moment for defining what is next for housing and its racial justice agenda. We partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco to share a report that's still available on our website and still shaped a lot of the understanding in the region, to talk about what happens when family budgets are crunched. I know a lot of people for a long time have focused on the conditions of housing and its relationship to health, and those conditions are all still so very important. And there's a very specific impact of housing affordability on health in communities. The report that we completed with the Federal Reserve showed that families who could comfortably afford their rent or mortgage payment could spend 2 times more on food and 5 times more on medical care. And what we know is the families who couldn't were squeezed in their family budget. And that squeeze in family budget often shows up in less money for food, and less money for medical conditions and preventative care, which has a long-term impact on when people are able to seek treatment for their health needs. Delayed treatment, I think we all know, has its own health impacts. Our Bar-High framework has really helped to shape how people understand conversations about housing and community, and I'd like to share it with you now. The framework here starts with issues of mortality, disease burden, and risk factors, and moves us through a conversation of living conditions that include housing, the physical environment, land use, the economy, social environment, in through institutional inequities and social inequities. And in that, we really see the impact of thinking of strategies that get us to broad-based impacts for health. And that's just so very important. The interventions that we make at the community capacity building, community organizing, and civic engagement that you see in the middle of that diagram, and in the strategic partnerships and advocacy that you see just slightly further up on that diagram, make huge difference for huge communities of people. And it's been a core component of our efforts and work. That framework, that understanding of the community conditions, including housing that shape health, is really echoed in the World Health Organization strategies. It's also a core component of the California Department of Public Health's Office of Health Equity's efforts, and is the foundational document for the American Medical Association's Health Equity Strategy. Really all know as institutions the importance of housing to health. And so I want to close by talking about the 3 things that our journey on housing and health has shared with us about being core components of what will move us forward on housing, racial equity, and community justice. We've seen that housing conditions, number 1, housing affordability with its own impacts that I just discussed, number 2, and then 3, choice and belonging have a huge impact on health. Thank you. We can take the slide down. And I want to talk a minute about this last one. Some of you are probably quite familiar with Bar-High's Black Hat efforts. It's a campaign to focus specifically on Black displacement in the Bay Area. It started over a series of coffees and conversations at kitchen tables talking about the displacement we've seen in the Bay Area. And for those of you who have been in Oakland for a long time, in Berkeley and San Francisco and East Palo Alto, you've noticed and felt the change, right? You might be somebody who's moved, or somebody who's still here as our neighbors are gone. And what we learned when we went from that anecdotal evidence we knew to the data shocked even those of us who have felt it for a long time. 60% of the Black population of East Palo Alto gone, between 40 and 50% in Berkeley, San Francisco, and Oakland. And those displacement numbers aren't just true in the Bay Area, they're true across California. And so across California, we've experienced massive numbers of Black displacement that correlate with the kinds of other disparities that we see for Black communities in housing, including in homelessness and in other strategies. And so, along with 50 other Black-led organizations across the Bay Area and now 80 statewide, we've started to come up with strategies that can address that very complicated issue of disproportionality in Black homelessness and affordability, and have really worked with the Urban Institute and others to think about that. And I think we're feeling a call to action for ourselves and our region that is quite focused on understanding how we have broad-based support for all communities in California around tenant protections, around housing, around economics and housing affordability, and how we have interventions for disproportionately impacted communities like the Black community on these issues of housing. And so I'll close by saying, I know we're going to have a very vibrant discussion about all of the opportunities we have in California this year to make big changes in housing and in the context of a complicated economic moment. And I look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate you setting that ground. Now I'd like to invite Shioni and Sam into the conversation. Welcome to you both. Shioni, let's start with you. If you could just take a moment to layer in any observations, reflections you're having about housing, health, racial justice from where you sit in your organization and a longtime leader in the state.
Thanks, Manal. I might start by introducing myself. As Manal said, my name is Shioni Flegel. I'm the Executive Director of Housing California. Housing California is a statewide organization. We've been around for a bit over 40 years now. And our mission is really to create a California with homes, health, and prosperity for all people in thriving communities. As you can imagine, that feels like a big aspiration to deliver on. And, you know, we in many ways feel like we're further away from that goal than ever before. As Melissa shared, our work is really grounded in a perspective that housing is a foundation for health and well-being for individuals, for families, and for communities. So our work spans a broad cross-section of housing issues. We work with partners seeking to end homelessness and to support people who are unhoused, who are currently unhoused. We are working to address the widespread and growing affordability crisis that's really touching everyone in California at this point, but that we know is disproportionately impacting low-income people and people of color. And so we work with nonprofit developers, with folks who build and manage housing, and then we work with folks who are themselves directly impacted by this crisis. And we have an organizing team that organizes residents who live in affordable housing, and with tenant advocates supporting a broad cross-section of tenants in California. What we're really holding close in this moment is that there is not one silver bullet, but that we need many different kinds of strategies and solutions to address this problem. Many of these are things we know how to do. The pandemic actually allowed us to really see firsthand how powerful our interventions can be. We accelerated investments in serving unhoused people. We made changes to how organizations could buy and acquire and fund the operations of permanent and interim housing. We learned what it could look like to actually provide renters with the assistance they need to stay in the home and to prevent and create policies that prevent eviction. So that there are a lot of things that we do know. I think the challenge that we see being our biggest work is really to double down on the level of investment that we're putting into our housing solutions. And that's not just for production, although that's certainly part of it, but it's for the whole range of housing supports that people need to actually access, secure, stay in, have healthy housing, all of the things that keep us stably housed and housed with health and opportunity in the ways that Melissa described. So from where we're sitting, we really see a problem that needs solutions brought to scale and that needs much deeper collaboration across advocates, across systems of government, across the private sector to actually bring these solutions to bear.
Thank you so much, Shioni. With that, I'm going to bring Sam into the conversation. Sam, thank you for joining us. Would love to hear a little bit about public advocates and what your thoughts are as a longtime housing advocate, legal expert. And then we're going to dive into some questions from our partners and get the three of you talking together a little bit.
Well, good morning. It's really exciting to be in dialogue with all of you. I'm Sam Tepperman-Gelfand. I'm a managing attorney at Public Advocates. Public Advocates is a statewide legal and policy organization that has been fighting for systemic changes that will advance racial and economic justice for more than 50 years. And we partner with community groups to elevate their voices and increase their power in decision-making, and to achieve tangible legal victories that can make people's lives better right now. We currently focus on housing, transportation, climate, and education justice. And I think in addition to what Melissa and Shioni have said, I wanted to elevate the power dynamics that we're dealing with in the housing sector as we are in sort of all of the fights for justice, and say that, I think we have the unjust housing systems that we have now that are causing low-income people of color, immigrants to struggle with housing and therefore struggle with a whole range of issues, including health in their lives. And we have those because the voices and the needs of people on the front lines have not been centered in policymaking around housing. And so I would say there are a lot of solutions out there for housing, and the places that we need to be looking for those solutions are in the communities and in the community leaders who have been systemically excluded from opportunity in housing as they have in education and health and economic opportunity. So I think that, we really believe that to get the solutions we need, we also need to change who are the decision makers, whose voices are valued, and how do we get to a place where our housing systems are really driven by the needs for people for stable, affordable, safe shelter, rather than by profit motives from the development, landowning, and other communities that have really seen housing more as an economic driver of private profit rather than being driven by the needs of people for housing and shelter. And so I think if we center those community voices, if we support the communities that are struggling with housing insecurity right now because of systemic injustices, and put them and their voices and their power at the center of our policymaking, that a lot will be possible and that we'll be able to get out of the ongoing crisis that we've been in of housing affordability.
Thank you, Sam. I have some questions that I'm ready to throw out there that were informed by our early registrants and also our planning. And one of them, we were really careful to say that this housing crisis that we're in was a long time in the making. It was certainly not brought on by the pandemic, and we're not out of the pandemic and all of the echoes. So we wanted to bring that sort of sensibility to that. But at the same time, I wanted to sort of pose to you all as a group and, what did sort of in your reflections, how do you sense make what happened? What was able to happen for housing that seemed sort of impossible just before the peak of the pandemic? And what now, as you're sort of looking back on some of the doors that seem to be closing, to me faster than I imagined that they would, in terms of, we could start with eviction moratoriums, but any number of things. Just sort of would love your strategic lens. You all are collaborators. So anyone, jump in with that. Maybe Melissa, start with you and then do a round on that.
Yeah, that is such a great question. Because, when the pandemic hit, you probably all remember that there was a lot of concern about the number of people who were already really in a tight budget spot before the pandemic and had lost wages very early on in the pandemic, and what that was going to mean for housing stability, and what a complicated a need to do something quickly really came about. And what happened is there were advocacy groups all across the state who had been building capacity and knowledge and relationships all across the state that were able to really quickly activate and to move the eviction moratoriums in place. I know for a lot of people who read it in the paper, it seemed like this immediate sudden thing, but actually there was capacity built, funded by groups like the California Endowment and San Francisco Foundation and many others that had been building strong housing equity agendas over a long period of time, really closely connected to tenants and able to mobilize quickly. At Bar High, we provided the health rationale to those groups that were already in motion, really, so they would have language too from health departments. And then we supported inside governments with some of the legal language they could use to move forward eviction moratoriums, with the idea that we could move moratoriums fast. And that was the thing. At that moment in the pandemic, everyone was saying, look how fast we can move with political will. And I think that political will, that is still the lesson, is that the pressures haven't changed. The incredible health risks that come from evictions and really tight budgets caused by really high housing costs haven't changed. And I think, like Shioni said, that political will is so important to moving this next phase at scale.
Yeah, I might build on that a bit. And I know Sam's going to have a lot to say because we had the privilege of working together through the pandemic, the pain and privilege. The political will feels crucial, as does the community building work that happened. So California has really been an amazing place over the last 3 decades, really, before that, of course, as well, but over the last 3 decades, communities of color have really doubled down in the work to organize and build movement infrastructure to allow us to respond to these both long-term aspirations that we carry and the near-term shocks that kind of come into our communities. And I think we really saw the power of that during the pandemic. I think we also, the political will can't be underscored enough. In the homelessness space, we saw government suddenly making resources available to buy buildings, to bring people in from the streets like tomorrow, not in 2 weeks or in 2 years. We had cash assistance happening from our federal government and our state government in ways that we've never seen before. And in California, we saw childhood poverty cut in half in like less than a year. And, those are things people had worked on for generations to try and move the needle on. So we really saw the power of political will, and we saw the impact of these strategies, that these strategies actually work. During the eviction moratoriums, people in California did not get evicted. We saw like a massive stabilization of households that had always been precarious, and that the pandemic had only made more precarious. And that's something that, advocates had been saying for a long time, like, hey, if you just put these protections in place, we won't see this cycling in our communities. We'll see people be able to stay in homes. And we really did see that. what's disappointing to me is that as a broader community in California, we didn't hold on to those wins and really collectively lift them up to say, like, look, we could actually create a California that works for everyone, where everyone can be protected and cared for and invested in. We let ourselves slide back into kind of pre-pandemic status quo, both in terms of politics, but also in terms of the policies and investments that we're willing to make. So I think as advocates, that's a reality that we're really grappling with, is how do we take the lessons out of this period of time and build back some of that will to really create change, because we saw the profound way that they can move the needle for the work that we're all doing.
Sam, as you come in, if you could just offer some thoughts on why it's not that the advocates stopped having the will. What do you really think is going on? How do we unpack and explain that?
Yeah, this is a real moment of ongoing reflection, I think, for all of us, because I think in part what was won on housing justice and stabilizing families and communities in the pandemic really was unimaginable beforehand. I mean, to have an 18-month period where everyone in California who was a renter was stable in their home, even if they fell behind on rent due to the pandemic, and then to have that back rent, mostly covered. That's some hiccups and, not a perfect implementation of that, but that basic protection, would have been unthinkable, and even wasn't unthinkable in the first months of the pandemic. I would say that, there was political will that was fought for by all of us, I think, to get the political attention on this issue and to get that kind of action. And I think that one of the keys that happened in the pandemic is that there was a heightened understanding and a new awareness that housing insecurity and making sure that everyone in our communities has a stable roof over their heads is something that impacts all of us, that all of our well-being is interconnected, that, housing is not just something that's an individual struggle and an individual responsibility, but that actually when we have people unhoused, when we have essential workers losing their homes, when we have longtime community members forced out on the streets or forced to double up with family members, that is creating, in the pandemic, that was creating a very tangible, immediate public health crisis for everyone that no one could insulate themselves from, no matter if their specific economic and housing situation was stable. The instability of the community around them was impacting them directly. And I think that getting over that imaginative hurdle and sort of understanding of what home means and what community means and the interconnectedness that we live in throughout California, I think was really critical to getting that mass action, because it was something that was not just, politicians weren't saying, okay, we just need to do that for those people. It's like, we need to do this for all of California to economically and thrive and to stay healthy. And so I think that is something that, when we're talking about what we need to get sustained post-pandemic, and the thing that I'm sort of most surprised has waned is that understanding of collective interconnectivity for all of our families. And so I think that, we need to be prepared for the next health crisis, the next environmental crisis, and build those strong communities and not just be in reactive mode when those things happen, but to build in that stability and resilience up front. And I think that, there's been not as much of that held on sort of as I was hoping in the pandemic, and not as much of those wins. But I do think that mindset still sticks with all of us in the back of our heads somewhere, and in our emotional cores, and that we can be drawing on that to make longer term systemic change moving forward.
I want to pull a thread through that and turn it to you, Melissa, first on this. But it seems like the reality of our our connection and our interdependence that you described is equally true for us on lines of race, ethnicity, and culture. And this summer, we in California made a historic leap with the California Reparations Task Force. And earlier this week, the California Black Freedom Fund hosted a really beautiful session, actually, on this matter. But the reality of some of the things, Melissa, you were describing in your opening remarks of being able to move forward in reparative, healing ways on multiple issues, and yet not having this nuance that this must be done for the descendants of enslaved people, but this is not just a Black issue. This is a California issue. This is about our collective improvement healing. And even if we don't, on moral grounds, on economic grounds, having everyone included and prosperity. And so they have all that. They have over 100 policy recommendations, including on housing. And Melissa, just from the work that you started, to talk about, touched on the Black hat, the disproportionality of displacement. Can you just talk about how that whole framing that Sam just shared shows up for you in sort of the you didn't use this term, but the targeted universalism, perhaps?
Yes. Absolutely. And that is one of the things that we think quite a bit about is targeted universalism. Sam, when you were talking and talking about that moment in the pandemic where people were really recognizing our collective connectedness, the challenge that I think what happened in the pandemic is what we sometimes see after our activations around wildfires, where for a moment, everyone remembers they're connected. And the challenge I think we have with our long-term housing cost issues and with long-term racism, particularly as it shows up as anti-Black racism and the long legacy of slavery, and then what followed after as the other kinds of institutional and policy decisions that really work to constrain income for Black people, to strip assets, even when assets were gained. Those things are longer term. You have to know a lot of history to know them. And while they're longer term, they can sound sometimes to people like long ago. But the truth is, if you track it back through your own family, it's a parent or a grandparent, right? And it's really none of it's that far away. And so I think the Black Reparations Task Force has done an incredible job of doing that tracking back. So their report documents a history of harms that have harmed Black communities across the state, and documents a sort of history really that's a microcosm of our country around the way that we've seen just really strong disproportionate impacts that continue to this day in ways that cause a 6-year difference in life expectancy, that cause huge differences in birth outcomes, that cause differences in our housing stability. And so, starting to have strategies that take a look at where the disproportionality is strongest, that center that in the way that Sam talked about earlier, and then design strategies that really improve that is a way to set strategies that are going to work really for whole communities and then for the whole state. And so that's something that we've been really excited about seeing move into place. Yeah.
If I could jump in with a sort of legal and policy overlay, because I think all of that is right. There's actually a relatively new law in California that requires every local government agency and every state agency to be, what's the wonky term is affirmatively furthering fair housing. But what that really means is to study that historic and current inequality based on race, based on immigration status, based on disability, and to study what is causing that, what the current manifestations of that systemic injustice are, and then to take affirmative steps to remedy that inequality. And this is a process that every city and county in the state is going through right now, and that state agencies need to do. But I think we've seen from an organizing perspective and power perspective that this mandate that government agencies actually talk about the real sources of this problem, and give communities that know that this is about systemic racism and systemic injustice the opportunity to take that into the public forum of decision makers and say, we need to shine a spotlight on this and you need to do something about it, is again not a magic bullet that's going to immediately fix it, but I think is the right frame. And we now have a legal tool to get the framework out there in decision making that we need to get the right solutions.
Thanks, Sam. Shioni, I'm sort of wanting to turn to you, and I don't know exactly what the question I want to ask you is, but it has something to do with the fact that you've had a long career not in housing, but in other aspects of our physical public infrastructure. And some of what we know is needed at scale is a change in our whole sort of the way we finance. And Sam, you talked about this. And so your experience drawing down real dollars and changing the way we fund something as important and basic as housing. And just wondering if there's anything you want to sort of throw into the mix of this conversation. I mean, we know this one conversation isn't enough, and we hope to come back for more, but I think we're sweeping the terrain for really important things. So Shioni, anything coming up for you in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. Our housing is not just a physical structure. It's a whole community. It's a community experience. It's, what Sam was describing about affirmatively furthering fair housing isn't just like, do you have a roof over your head, but is your home providing you with access to quality schools? Do you have safe drinking water? Can you walk in your neighborhood? It is a much more complex experience. And for too many of our communities in California, none of that's working. It's not working inside the home. It's not working in the immediate vicinity of the neighborhood. It's not working in the way it's connected to larger regional assets and resources. So the questions around how we invest in public infrastructure that creates connection for people, that supports health for people in their home and in their neighborhood, those are really important parts of the equation. They also affect whether or not you can build housing. So we know we need over 1 million new units of affordable housing to meet the needs of Californians. That's not just a question of like, do I have a piece of land to put a structure on? It's who's going to build it, how are they going to get water, where's the energy coming from, what's the school that they're going to access, what are the gazillions of sources we're going to use to finance that building, how will tenants be treated when they're in the building, will they have some agency over the experience of their housing, or will they be subject to a landlord who is thinking about profit and not well-being? There's a whole slew of things. So the public financing stuff is particularly important. California, I think the LAO just released something today or earlier this week saying that we're facing a over $60 billion deficit as a state. We're going to have really hard choices to make about how we spend our resources and whether we're investing in childcare or in housing or in elder care. And guess what? Those are all the same people. You can take one of them away, but it's the same people. So we're really trying to help both our policymakers and our partners in this space think about the question of how do we actually grow the pie, because California needs more money to solve this problem. We need to use the money we have in different ways, and we saw some of that during the pandemic, so it's not an excuse to not like hold the mirror up to see how we do things differently. But we also need to grow the pie and to be thinking about how do we actually make a tax system and a tax structure and a revenue system that can allow us to fund these things. Communities around California are grappling with really interesting questions around democracy and what it takes to actually put new revenue initiatives on our ballots. Should a supermajority have to vote? Do we need 2/3 of people to vote? Right now, we have really complex barriers in place that require communities to get margins of support from voters that are just insurmountable in too many places. So there's a whole set of things that don't sound like housing that are related to our broader kind of economic systems and taxation systems that become really crucial for providing the resources for the immediate structures and units and homes that people need, but also for the whole other sets of infrastructure and supports that make those homes places that people can really thrive.
Thank you. So before I turn to some of the questions that we're getting from our panel, from our audience, excuse me, this issue can be daunting and big. And I want to know from you all, because you've been in it for a while, what is one thing that gives you hope or inspiration that we not only must do this and succeed, but can do this? And maybe if we can just do a round of, sort of what keeps you motivated in this arena. And then I'll figure out a question from our audience or two that we can get to.
So for me, it's remembering that these moments that if we keep working and we stay ready, there are these moments where you just can push so far through the door. And so I think that the pandemic and the eviction moratoriums are a great example of that. I think things that we've seen around the rent caps, great example of that. That there's this way in which the day-to-day, as you're trudging through, moving the campaign, having it work sometimes, having it not work others, that readiness in the moments that come is driven by those moments that seem the slowest. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what has kept me in this work really is the individual and collective leadership of people who are struggling so much with housing and a whole host of other things, and are still making the time in their lives to organize their neighbors and community members and to, talk over and over and over to politicians and government staff who don't understand their issues at first and get to understand them bit by bit over time. So I think that sustained leadership over years and decades that we've seen, and the growing community of leaders, is really what gives me hope that we will solve this. And I think that, it's not, every step is not forward, but I think overall we are moving in the direction that we need to go with the leadership from our communities.
Shioni, what gives you inspiration for this work?
Yeah, I'd really second what Sam said. You have to be a little bit either crazy or an optimist to do statewide policy work focused on racial justice and housing, because it can feel impossible. Like these are hundreds of years old problems that we're trying to tackle. And then I have the incredible privilege of working with advocates. We work with residents in the Residents United Network who have 1,000 other things they could be spending their invaluable time on, and they choose to show up for these fights. And those folks really inspire me. They give me energy. They're my partners, they're my friends, sometimes family. And that's what keeps me on. I also have 2 children. And, like most parents, really want them to have a future that looks different than the one I was born into. So it's the people side that keeps me in this work and keeps me sustained.
So on that note, I want to pull in a question from, I hope I'm saying your name right, Abimael Chavez Hernandez. They ask, do you actually feel like there's enough genuine engagement with communities to mobilize people towards the policies that we need to build a California where all can thrive? And I think you all shared examples of where you are. What else do you think, just in response to that question?
I think this is an area where we always have to be growing. And early in my career, I had the privilege of working with this amazing organizer, elder woman in the Central Valley, who told me one day, like, why do I have to spend my life going to every government meeting to tell government how to do their job. They should just do their job. And part of their job is caring for me, for people like me, for my community. Like, I should be able to have a different job. My job shouldn't have to be telling them how to do theirs. Unfortunately, that is still the place that we're at. And in many ways, our democracy depends on people being engaged in the system, and in the work of making that system stronger. Because right now, it's not designed for folks who it's having very dire outcomes on. So I would say always more. We always need to be doing more in this space. And it's, why I feel really lucky to get to work with, again, directly impacted communities, as well as people who have deep technical expertise. We need all of those things in this work.
And I totally agree with that. I would just highlight the local level and local campaign work. I think we've talked a lot about statewide policy, but in the struggle for renters' rights, for example, we are seeing robust campaigns that have dozens and dozens or hundreds of local community members engaged for stronger rent stabilization, rent control, just cause eviction, anti-harassment policies to stabilize and make sure that tenants have a fair shot in local communities where there has never been anything like that introduced. And so I think when we're thinking about statewide system change, thinking about how important that local engagement and leadership is, and the local change that can lead toward statewide systemic change is really, I think, where there's a lot of activity happening right now.
Melissa, a word on this?
I agree with everything that I've heard. I think there are so many people mobilized. I think we always have to be growing that, because there need to be moments where people can take a break and somebody else step in, and then step in together. And I think we see that over and over again. And I think California has built a lot of mobilization, and the powers that Sam talked about at the beginning that counter that mobilization are exceptionally powerful. And so it's important to be driving that. I also think there's increasing opportunities inside government to find people whose whole job it is to focus on equity. And so one of the things that we work on is support for equity leads and equity officers in positions across the state of California in public health departments, but also in city managers' offices, county administrators' offices, whose job it is to really push government on racial equity efforts. And I think that that's an important part of government to be supporting and helping grow, because it is both true that we all should be engaged, and that people should be listening to those most impacted to the problem in elected leadership, and that should be who's in elected leadership, but also true that that the more we can have government doing the best it can on equity, the more the conversations we have on equity can evolve and get better and achieve more.
Thanks. I'm going to pull another question in from Peter Cohen asking about ACA 1. And I'm always terrible at remembering what the names and numbers of bills and things are. So if one of you could explain the point of ACA 1, and then I think mention the statewide local implications, and then anything we should be really concerned about assuring to make sure the promise of it is equitable. So I'm going to let you three kind of self-organize around that.
I can get started on that. So ACA 1 is a state constitutional amendment that the legislature passed in September that would lower the voter threshold for local bond initiatives for housing and infrastructure. Right now, locals are required to get 2/3 of voters to support a bond before it passes. In the past, we've lowered that threshold for education investments. So this proposes to do the same thing for infrastructure and housing bonds. From where we sit, that's a fundamental issue of democracy, that we believe people should have the ability to tax themselves or to bond for things that they think are important in their communities. It's been a huge barrier to funding housing and infrastructure in communities all over California. Many communities can get like to 62%, but can't get to 64 or to 59%. So they have a large majority of their population saying that they want to do something, but get stopped. So it's a really important tool. It alone will not lead to success on this issue, because then communities have to actually make the choice to pass bonds, and they have to design those programs in ways that actually serve equitable outcomes. There is some, by design language in ACA 1 in terms of the kinds of things that allows to meet that new standard. But the real work, to what both Sam and Melissa were speaking to, is that in localities, communities are going to have a very active role in determining what kinds of things they want to put on their ballots in order to fund programs that serve the populations that really need these investments. The Bay Area region right now is looking at a regional initiative that this ACA 1 could help make easier to pass, that would allow for significant new investments in housing, and community groups are really coming together with leaders in the affordable housing development sector and the small business community, et cetera, to think about, like, how should this be shaped? What should it look like? There are some other parts of California that are exploring similar conversations. But it's really the state giving locals a new tool to do their part in solving our housing challenges.
Melissa or Sam, anything to add or jump in on that?
No, I agree with all that she said. No.
I think the one thing I would add is that I think that local ability to raise revenues can also unlock new creative community-driven solutions for the housing crisis that currently are hard to fund and hard to realize. And I want to particularly mention social housing, which is something that communities around California and nationally have been pushing for. And this is really housing that's permanently affordable, that's government and nonprofit run, that has community leadership, and that is affordable to a full range of folks who can't afford housing in the market right now. So I think is an additive solution that we've seen a lot of success with in the past in the US and in other countries to, at scale, house people who need stable housing outside of the market. And I think that the more we have access to revenue tools to fund that, the more we're going to see creative solutions coming out and being supported by the voters and communities.
Thank you. We are rapidly approaching the end of our hour together. We had more questions and we had time to get to all deep. We touched on a few. We have a question about neutralizing opposition and the folks like private entities, Association of Realtors and Apartment Owners, and also the role of philanthropy in helping to support the bridging of health-associated entities with tenants and housing organizers. We probably can't get to that, but we will think about some resources we can put in there. But I'd like to just see, Melissa, do you have a closing remark just on a last round before I do the official closing words?
I will just say that we have such an incredible opportunity in California to prioritize housing and racial justice in the same at the same time, and in such important ways. And so we have a number of different campaigns running in different parts of the state that both provide opportunities for us to activate and to learn what could build the next more just version of our housing system. And we have an opportunity through the State Reparations Task Force, through campaigns like We Run a Black Hat, focused on Black displacement across California, to really start to have solutions too that focus on the most disproportionality that we've seen in the housing space that has lasted for us for generations. We can choose to say no more. And so I hope that there will be a lot of people who join us in that.
Thank you, Melissa, Shioni, and
Mhm.
Sam, for joining us today. You, among those that you said, also have other things you can be doing with your valuable time, and we are deeply grateful for you to spend your time, share your wisdom with us here today and in an ongoing way. And as everybody who plans events knows, 95% of the work happens in the prep. And so thank you all for the team here and all of you for engaging in that. This has been an insightful, thought-provoking conversation. And as I said, I hope one of many more. We appreciate all the audience who came today, also the many who signed up and will be receiving the recording and beautiful materials from our colleagues at the resource link. They'll be there by tomorrow. Full bios of our speakers will be there, and they should be up there tomorrow. At the end, after I conclude the program, there is a survey we would love for you to fill out. There'll be a QR code that shows up on the screen, and also a link will appear in the chat. We also invite you all to return to us for our next Policy Perspectives webinar on January 31st. It will focus on the 2024 California state budget. We touched on that a little bit today, just a mention of how many hard choices in this unique budget situation we're in. So we hope you join us, and more information will be in your inboxes soon. Thank you all. Thank you to our speakers. Have a great day. This concludes our Policy Perspectives program for today.